Stories don't define you. How you tell them will.
Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Story Maker at Elkins Consulting. In my work with coaching clients, I guide people to improve their communication using storytelling as the foundation of our work together. What I've realized over years of coaching and podcasting is that the majority of people don't realize the impact of the stories they share on their internal messages and on the people they're sharing them with. What really lights me up is guiding executives in uncovering the stories in their lives that are meaningful. The stories that, when shared with the right audience in the right way, connect, inspire, and motivate. Here's what a former client had to say about our work together. As a leader of leaders, I struggle with how and when to use my stories to emphasize the points my audience is looking for. It's a delicate balance between sounding like I'm bragging and delivering a message that needs to be heard. Sarah's approach to storytelling clears that obstacle so that you can deliver a clear and concise message using your stories to emphasize your points. It's truly amazing when it all comes together. Greg McDonough, Blackburn Capital Advisors, and President of the Entrepreneurs Organization of Washington, D.C. Visit elkinsconsulting.com to learn more about working with me. For our listeners, this is Joe Jacobi, and he lives in Spain on the Spanish side of the Pyrenees. And I'm so excited to talk to you today because we've known each other for years on LinkedIn. I saw one of your first posts, I think. I responded to one of your very first posts about Olympic training and how it translates to the business world. And I'm all about analogies. And so I'm just so grateful. Thank you so much for joining me, Joe.
Sarah, it is an absolute pleasure. I think that everyone, because we come from LinkedIn and we come from a place where, there's a lot of messages being pushed out there. And with you, it's just, it's always about the person. It's always about the character. It's always about, your sense of really connecting with people and wanting the best for people. And so this is really what it should be all about. I know it can be very easy to talk about what we don't like about social media, what we don't like about certain platforms, what we don't like about certain customs, traditions that sort of play out on the various platforms. But then, the good stuff really kind of rises to the top, and you're part of that good stuff, and it makes it a better place. So thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Well, for our listeners, I always try to start off with a question to ask you, which is, can you tell us something about yourself that most people might not know? Something that isn't on your resume or your LinkedIn profile, maybe something from your childhood that people who know you now might be surprised.
I had a paper route when I was a kid. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, and I was a paper boy for the Washington Star newspaper. And I had that for a couple of years. I had it until the paper went out of business, actually. And so I was a paper boy at one point.
Which neighborhood were you in?
I grew up in Bethesda. I grew up in Bethesda, Maryland, just outside of the DC area. So both of my parents were born and raised in the Washington, DC area. And then they raised 5 boys. I have 4 brothers in Bethesda. And which is interesting. I mean, for a lot of reasons, Washington has a lot of the United States attention these days. And, when you think about, especially the time that my mom and dad were raising a family there, a nation's capital was really designed as a very kind of a transient kind of place by design. I mean, it had a lot of jobs there that were geared towards people coming into the city, working at a super hard pace for a short period of time, and then rolling out, and then a new wave of people would come in. And this is kind of true for nation's capital all over the world. Is just the nature of it. Is you really want the most passionate people, but that energy level is very hard to sustain. And, my mom and dad just sort of had more of that kind of snail's pace to living there, while a lot of people were sort of driving to rush ahead. My parents really kind of took their time with being there. They were different than a lot of the people who lived there. They were the long-term people. They weren't going anywhere. And now the DC area has actually changed quite a bit. When technology really started coming into the DC area, out near Dulles Airport and kind of all the way into the DC area now, there's this big technology corridor that really kind of brought more longer term stability, more people interested in living in the area for a longer period of time. But really, for a lot of time that my parents were sort of raising a family that, they were different than a lot of typical people who came to the DC area. So that was kind of an interesting part of growing up there and being a part of growing up in the nation's capital.
Well, that's kind of funny. I keep coming back to this idea that you were on a paper route in Bethesda and that you might have delivered a paper to my in-laws, my aunt and uncle-in-law, who lived in Bethesda for decades. And
now I'm curious, like, where in Bethesda did they live?
Chevy Chase area. They were, cool. Yeah, I remember going to their house a couple of times when my husband and I were dating, and then shortly after we got married. But my husband and I were both born in Washington, D.C. So I think it is a transient place. And when I tell people I was born in the district at Columbia Hospital for Women at M and what is it, 16th and M or 14th and M or something like that. And we lived in the DC area. We actually lived in Sugarland Run in Fairfax when I was born. And then my sister was born, I think, at Georgetown Medical. And then we moved away when I was 5 years old.
Okay.
But we visited a lot on the East Coast because that's where my both sets of grandparents lived and lots of aunts and uncles and cousins. So we would go back east periodically to visit. And when I finished my undergrad degree in Fort Collins, Colorado, I had a paid internship in Washington, D.C. and moved back there as an adult. Well, I don't know if you could call me an adult at 23, but I was trying to live like an adult. And I remember moving over there and I felt like I was at home, even though I hadn't lived there in 20 years, almost 20 years. But I remember vividly showing up and feeling like I was home. And then I met my husband, must be about a year and a half after I moved there. And we had a baby a couple of years after that. And he was born at Columbia Hospital for Women, the same exact hospital where I was born. And then when he was 6 months old, we moved across the country to Montana from Washington, D.C. And a few months later, we saw the news from the Washington Post that Columbia Hospital for Women shut down. Wow. So it was kind of amazing when you think about the timing that I was born there, then my son was born there, then they shut down a few months after he was born. So I'm not a believer in coincidence. So it's just fascinating the way these things work out.
No doubt. When was your son born? Which year?
98, October of 98.
Okay. Of course, I sort of just feel I have to sort of measure everything against like how the Redskins were doing around that time in the late 1990s. Or let me reframe that. The Washington football team. I should say. I'm a lot more removed from the professional sports scene in the United States after living far away from the U.S. for 3.5 years. But I did grow up with all the Washington area sports teams and I was in a different way. I was a part of that culture too, as an athlete, the whitewater canoe. You would never think this. I think we've talked about this about Montana in the past that, typically the best rivers, the best whitewater rivers in the United States tend to be in more rural, mountainous, secluded areas. You think about Appalachia in the southeastern United States. You think about, the Rockies and all the different mountains we have in the western United States where water runs a lot more wild and free. And then you have the Potomac River in the Washington, D.C. area, which is this amazing whitewater, like really good whitewater from like Great Falls over the next like 8 miles downstream, almost to Georgetown. The whitewater, the fall line is right around Chain Bridge. And above that, though, is like just great whitewater all the way through in a major metropolitan area. And the reason that was actually important to me in my life is that when I started, really taking an interest in whitewater canoeing in the early to mid 1980s, and the United States was really, really good at the sport at the time. It wasn't an Olympic sport, but the U.S. was really good at the sport. And all the world at my first workout that I went to, my first canoeing training session I went to when I was 12, everyone was like a world champion or a world medalist or the legendary coach of the sport. I mean, it was, and the reason it played out this way was because there was no money in the sport. Like you paddled because you loved the sport, but that also meant that the athletes needed ways to take care of themselves. And because the DC area was a big city, it was easier to get jobs. It was easier to go to university. And so it was a really great place to train. And I kind of had this Malcolm Gladwell outliers moment, which is like, what are your fortuitous circumstances in life? And I ended up in one of the greatest training cultures of all time, just at a time when the United States was hitting its peak. And I was just paddling with like the equivalent of Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, and being coached by Phil Jackson, and I had no right being kind of playing among these level of athletes, but that's what I grew up in. And so canoeing had its own sort of unique existence, in this major metropolitan city. And you would never think that, but you are surrounded by some of the most beautiful natural resources and natural beauty that exists anywhere in the United States. And boy, could you imagine having like having Washington, D.C. like right in the middle of that? Like you couldn't,
No.
and
it
so
wouldn't work.
Right. So the Potomac River is like this really kind of almost strangely bizarre natural resource in this very intense, hard driving big city, and it's also an amazing way if people have the self-awareness to take advantage of it in the Washington, D.C. area to really disconnect and unplug. It's like nature, as you know, and you and your neighbors all know, your community knows, you're never going to find like a better friend to help you disconnect and help let go and help find degrees of kindness and being kind to yourself and being gentle with yourself than nature. Right. And, that is there for people that live in Washington, D.C. as well. Although I think it's still a lot harder for people from Washington, D.C. to do that and to work with that than it would be people from where you're from. I think it's a more like in the DNA of the culture where you live to really work with nature, to kind of do some of those things, to disconnect, to be more kind to yourself, to unplug and just breathe a little bit and get a little okay with yourself. It's not everyone has an easy time getting there.
And I really believe a lot of that has to do with who you surround yourself with. So I moved from Colorado, which is very outdoorsy. And I never considered myself outdoorsy, even though I always loved hiking. But I never considered myself an outdoorsy person. I wasn't a camper. I didn't go fishing. I floated slow rivers on an inner tube as entertainment, but that was the extent of it. But I moved to Washington, D.C., and I realized this as I look back. This is 20 years later, I look back at my time in DC and I realized moved there all by myself. And one of the things I would do is I'd hop in the car and go to Great Falls, Maryland and hike by myself. That's how I would decompress. And I started meeting other people that were interested in doing things like that with me. And then I met my husband. And here's the irony. I had spent all of high school and college in Colorado in some of the most pristine mountain ranges of the nation. And my husband taught me how to fly fish in the DC area.
Yeah.
I learned fly fishing on the Potomac, on the Shenandoah, on the Delaware, in the lakes nearby. I caught my first goldeneye on a little popper in a lake in Northern Virginia. So I did all those things in DC. And then we moved to Montana. And that's where I got to truly start to explore being an outdoorsy type of person. And I still battle that internal message that I'm not outdoorsy. And yet I just heard from my 19-year-old son that when his girlfriend, who's 18, came to town and we went on a very long hike together, just the two of us, she said, I could barely keep up with her. Which of course had to pat myself on the back because I just turned 50 last year. So it was an aha moment that I'm getting all this evidence that yes, indeed, I am outdoorsy.
You know what it really strikes me. This comes up in conversations, that I have a lot, or maybe just a different way to think of it is that, I think one of the things that we kind of wrestle with our human brains, these human brains that we're going to be stuck with to the very end. It's like what we've signed up for as being human beings. Like we're going to carry these things until the very end, which is like good news, bad news kind of thing. But I think something that you said that it makes me think is that we do get very caught up in the identity of who we are. Mm-hmm. An Olympian, a doctor, an outdoorsy person, or whatever that might be. And I remember writing one of my posts a few years ago, and I don't know if this was the exact name, but it was pretty close. But I think it was like less nouns, more verbs. And the thinking behind this was that instead of thinking about the identity, which is like more like a noun or a proper noun, right?
To
and
be.
It's like,
well, right.
And then
to act.
But what does an outdoorsy person do? Like they indulge in the outdoors. They walk, they hike, and it's like, well, I do that, and it's like I do the actions. And so I think when we actually think about the verbs, and it's like we kind of give our human brain telling us like what we can't do and we can't be a little bit, we trip it up a little bit on that. And we actually think, well, I do that. I mean, I'm walking like, and that's kind of where I think we kind of can help ourselves, a little bit with that, and it's like, as opposed to, I'll ask, even clients that get kind of hung up on the identity element and be like, well, what does that mean? Like what do you do within that identity? Like what are the verb? Like what are the actions? Tell me what that is. What does that feel like? What are the experiences you want to feel? And when you sort of shift, those parameters a little bit, you can identify with the whole pursuit a little bit differently and be like, yeah, I am doing that. But that is, really cool that you had that experience with your son's girlfriend. It's good.
I need to interrupt you just because I want to go back a little bit. I love that you said that when we interrupt that thought, it gives us an opportunity to kind of, I call it a flat tire that makes you change directions or it makes a subtle shift. And what you're saying, what I'm hearing is when you introduce even a subtle contradiction in the way you've been thinking, it opens up this whole different opportunity about how you see yourself. And not that you need a label. I mean, nobody needs a label necessarily. But
that's right.
But we do need identity. And if we need to associate something with something positive about ourselves, why not use it as I'm outdoorsy, or I'm an artist, or I'm creative? These are beautiful labels to own. if we can give ourselves that contradiction and say, oh, maybe this does actually fit me. And I like that label. I like being known as outdoorsy.
Well, I'll tell you something very interesting along the lines of being outdoorsy. So over here in Europe, in a lot of countries, kids get exposed to canoeing via their physical education programs at school. And what I've noticed over the years is that when I meet people and the conversation turns to whitewater canoeing, people in different countries respond differently to their experiences in physical education, the young person. So when I meet someone in the Czech Republic who, and by the way, we'll take two countries, the Czech Republic and France. So in these two countries, the average person in both countries knows the name of like the top whitewater canoeing athletes in both countries, right? It's just, they stand out. The president of the Paris 2024 Olympic Games is Tony Estanguet, like a whitewater slalom paddler. 10 out of 10 people you stop on the street in Paris are going to know who Tony Estanguet is, or 99 out of 100 anyway are going to know who Tony is, right? And in Czech Republic, they'll know who the top whitewater slalom people are. So now let's talk about the people who are not the top people, but people that were just introduced to whitewater canoeing as a kid and through physical education. When I meet someone in the Czech Republic and we start having this conversation, they very quickly say, yeah, we tried that sport in physical education when I was young, but I was never very good at it. I only raced like little local races and then I stopped. So I didn't really do it for real. And then in France, it's like the attitude towards the same experience is completely different. Like, yeah, I was in the Tony Estanguet like generation and I just did some local races, but like that was my generation. And there's just a really big difference in the way the Czech people and the French people identify with their doing these activities. One thing believes they didn't really do sport because they didn't do it at a super high level. And the other one thinks like they completely did the sport because they did it with people who went on to do it at a really high level. And I just think it's interesting, to make that observation. Whenever I get that, when someone tells me that they just went floating on a river, oh, I didn't do it like you did. And I said, well, wait a minute. You were on the river, right? You weren't on the riverbank. No, we were on the river going down. Well, how is that so different than what I was doing? Like, I was just on the river too. Like, who cares? Like, if I was paddling hard or navigating, we both went to time and effort and took resources to actually not be standing or sitting on the riverbank, but to get into the water. We have that in common. And it's like, it doesn't matter what medal you won in the Olympic Games. If you actually got off of dry land and into a moving river, I don't care how fast it was moving, you were doing it.
Yep. I wonder if that has to do with modesty, being humble. In some cultures, that's really valued, and in others, it's not so much. And I'm sure that being valued in France is not something they're known for, just like Americans aren't known for being humble or modest.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that has a little bit to do with that.
It could be. It's so interesting when it comes up. My tendency is to pull people in. I mean, especially when it comes to the outdoors and especially when it comes to canoeing, where in the United States, kids are not going to their PE teachers and checking out canoes and kayaks during recess. Right? I mean, it is the last thing that we, in the United States, we need to be doing is coming up with reasons for people to feel excluded from nature, to feel excluded from the outdoors, to feel excluded from rivers. I'm always looking for the commonality. I'm always looking for like what what makes us the same, not what makes us different. And, and however you choose to enjoy rivers, my only little standard for that is, I am interested in the concept of being safe on rivers, and water safety and such, and the idea of, of life jackets and personal flotation devices, things like that. But it's besides that, yes, just whatever we can do to be more inclusive, not exclusionary. I'm all in on that. I just don't want people to ever feel like, oh, I'm not really in it because I'm not at that person's level. And I'm like, Did you enjoy it on your own terms? Did you enjoy an afternoon on the water with your friends? Did you notice things about the world, seeing the world from the middle of the river as opposed to seeing the water go by you from the riverbank? All right. Now we're having a different conversation. Now we're talking on the basis of commonality and inclusivity, not disconnect and exclusion.
And that's also where we can bring in self-reflection and analogies, which I think can be extremely powerful once somebody has experienced something like that. So, for instance, we can go back actually to the beginning of this conversation. The whole reason I wanted to interview you was that interview you did with Sarah Johnston, where you used the analogy of making small adjustments in your career or in your work or your resume, depending on where you're developing some clarity around what you want to do. And I loved how you used the analogy of paddling, of you're not going to fight the river. You can't fight the current, but you can make small adjustments with your paddle and the weight and the way you move your body so that you go the direction you want to go or that you think you want to go at any given moment, and being really present. So could you just tell our listeners briefly kind of what that was about and what you do in terms of your consulting practice and how you use that analogy? Yeah.
So let me start here, Sarah, with a little bit about actually being in the river and being, actually, let's even get more specific. Let's talk very specifically about our 1992 Olympic race here in La Seu d'Urgell on the Olympic Channel. And so the idea was, I was in a 2-person canoe, paddling with my canoe partner, Scott Strasball. So there wasn't just one of us in the boat, but there were 2 of us working together. And we're navigating a continuous set of whitewater river rapids for speed, but we're not just going straight down the river. We're actually kind of bobbing and weaving in and out of poles that are hung from wires above the river called gates. And, they're set up in sequential order, a lot like a slalom ski race, that marks where on the snow the skiers have to go. These poles really help they absolutely, mark on the river where the canoes have to go. So it's about agility and changing speed, changing directions. And our race is about 2 minutes long. And not only are you wanting to go fast, but you cannot touch these poles with your boat, paddle, or body, or you get penalty seconds added to your time. And there's judges that are officials that are looking to see if you touch these poles. So the idea is you want to be fast, but not touch the poles, or as the athletes say, fast and clean. And so at the 1992 Olympic race, I'm going to write about this a little bit later in this Sunday Morning Joe series that I'm doing right now, but never once in all the years have I ever said we were the fastest, we were the strongest, or we were the best. I don't believe any of those things. Even though we won a gold medal that day, I don't believe any of those things. The only thing, the sort of one and a half things that we did better than the rest of the field was that we corrected mistakes better than the other boats in the race. And related to that, I say one and a half, we did a better job of anticipating the mistakes before they happened. And I think those 2 things, we can just talk about the process of how that happens, making a training run down the Olympic course, but when you can actually tell people that when you just do that better than the other people, that can translate to actually standing on the top step of the Olympic podium, that will make you stop and think, because we're always thinking that like we have to have these standout, we have to perform to a completely different level than we've ever performed before. And really what it is that the river is this moving, changing medium that's kind of jostling your boat back and forth all over the place. And, it's like trying to ride a wild horse, so to speak, and you're trying to get some control. And it's like, you're not really trying to go fast necessarily. You're trying to keep the boat on a good course. And once you have that, then you can open it up and maybe, add, a little bit more, but you're trying to align the boat with the energy of the river, which is much stronger than you or me or anyone else. The river never stops. And it just, my canoe partner and I together, our combined weight, we were the smallest team, the lightest weight team in the race. And,
wow.
And our whole thing was we never showed up at the river trying to believe like we could beat the river, but we were more like trying to dance with it and really trying to capture the energy of the river into our boat, into our paddles, into our body in a way that now we've got the strongest force working for us and then some, anything else that we can add to it. So that's really the story of, kind of how we wanted. It wasn't being bigger, stronger, faster, better. Our results over time didn't suggest that, but Scott and I had a good sense of bringing out our best performance on race day. We practiced super hard, but we were really two very different people. And sometimes, we struggled with those differences a lot, and it took a lot of thought and a lot of planning and a lot of help to work through those differences. But I think those differences were 100% critical in ultimately, winning a gold medal at the Olympics. I often tell people we're in 180 degrees different in personality, but we're about 179. And I believe had we been about 175 degrees different, we probably would not have been Olympic champions. And so, yeah, this was 1990. This was 1992. And I understand that Scott and I were both white males, but we, this is what diversity in teams kind of meant to me, back in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, was working with someone who was immensely different than me, but figuring out how to take two very different perspectives of the world and bring them together. That also comes up in my coaching as well. And same with the course correction. I cannot imagine just leaving mistakes out on the water. It's like, I've written about this too. There's like a weight that we carry with us when we leave our mistakes uncorrected out. I give you a great work example of this. If you leave an organization to go to a new job and you kind of leave on bad terms and you kind of start checking out early and you kind of leave it as a mess for the team that you're leaving behind or for the next person coming in, that's an example of like not course correcting. And it's like someone will come in and fix that. Like the company that you've leaving behind will fix that. But you carry that weight. You don't think you do. Like you just think you're jumping on to the next great thing. But that weight adds up over time. You carry it with you. And that's just what, it's just like, it's no problem to change and to transition. I'm a huge advocate for that. But even in the calls and the clients that I've worked with where these kind of changes are inevitable, I'm always asking, not before we talk about what you're transitioning into and what the next great opportunity is going to be, how are we leaving this current situation?
Yes.
What does that look like? And even if it's like there's something there that is really not good and you're not looking to make peace with, okay, we can talk about that. but are there good things? Are there good people? Is there something about this experience that gave you something that you're really going to need? And if we can answer yes, how can we acknowledge that to come back in a positive way before we transition out of this and leave a mess for someone else?
Yeah. And I think what people don't realize is that, yes, you're going to have this internal weight. Call it regret, call it whatever you want. You're always going to know that was out of alignment with who you want to be. And even if you don't acknowledge it, it's there. But there's also the external weight you leave. And that's the reputation factor. People who are left to clean up your mess, they know your name. That's not going to go away. This is something that's going to stick. And I think about that a lot in the jobs that I left and how I left them, and the intensity of those last 2 weeks or the last 4 days or the last day, when you just want to make sure you leave it neat so that next person doesn't get messed up. You're not their fault. Whatever unresolved issue is going to remain unresolved. That doesn't belong to the person that's going to take your place. And that's the person that's going to struggle if you leave it badly. But I'd like to go back. Thank you. I'd like to go back to course correcting, fixing mistakes quickly, or preventing them in the first place by being present and seeing them before they happen, and making those course corrections. What I heard from you, especially when you're talking about using the energy of the river, the energy of that whitewater, I keep thinking back into what you were doing was using all the resources available to you in that moment, even the negative forces of the river, that you turn positive by embracing them. And the world around us being that whitewater, and making our tiny course corrections in order to end up where we want to be, at least temporarily. And knowing that there's so many times where you can't fight that power of the river, but you can make adjustments to bring other people with you in that smoother sailing through it. And then eventually make it to a point where you're not in the whitewater anymore. Like, I keep thinking about the Potomac at Georgetown, where it's fast, but it's wide and smooth, and you can paddle for it. We used to let the dog go swim in that current. It wasn't that strong, and she'd come right back after swimming a quarter mile. But there's always going to be a time where it smooths out. And if you can use all the resources you have, which includes the diversity of thought in that boat, your 178, 179 degree difference with your partner, valuing that and using it as a resource. That's what keeps popping into my head.
Yeah, it's such a wonderful and thoughtful way of talking about this. I think sometimes, on the river, maybe less in a competitive situation, but more in like when you're running more difficult, hard, challenging rapids, where there's more river flow, more danger, more rocks, bigger hydraulics. Sometimes there's elements of the water where you just end up in really hard, difficult, challenging situations where the boat is stuck in a hydraulic, or there's a lot of things happening. It's very hard to get your bearings on. And, in a lot of our modes, for a lot of people, the first mode is to just be like, I have to fight my way out of this. Like I have to fight. And, you mentioned how strong and how like negative force that the river can be. And it's just so counterintuitive. I wrote about the strategy of counterintuitive in a recent Sunday Morning Joe post, but that, sometimes you just need that moment to wait, to be patient. It's so hard to do. You think you need to be fighting for every moment, but if you can just take that moment to just wait and kind of gauge a little bit what is happening around me, give myself the ability to feel what the water is doing, to connect with it, to understand with it, and see, like maybe I can do something to adjust my body posture that affects the balance of the boat, which then maybe might release me. Or maybe, there's something I can do with my paddle, the way it's connecting with the water, that might change the pressure against the river, that might, change the release. Or maybe it might even be just the balance of the boat, and a way of kind of trying to recapture the energy of the river that seems like it's hurting me at the moment. But if I can readjust it, maybe I can get out of this situation. All of those options come from not fight, but actually more counterintuitively waiting, being a little patient, taking that short moment to gauge and try to understand, what is the river trying to tell you? The river is this moving thing of energy. It is talking to you. It is giving you a sign. It only knows to find ways to keep pushing downstream. So when you find yourself in those negative, situations that feel like this could be bad, and let's face it, it's big whitewater. It could be, but even if you're trying to work with that, it's such a hard thing. It's such a counterintuitive thing to do, to be patient. My bigger theme that I've been writing about in this series, I call it the pursuit of contentment on the river of uncertainty. And so contentment doesn't just mean happiness. Contentment can mean growth. It can mean adventure. It can mean risk. It can mean happiness and enjoyment as well. And it acknowledges that we have agency, we have skill, we have techniques that we can employ. That's one end of the scale, contentment. On the other end of the scale is that the river is just so uncertain. COVID is uncertain. Social inequality is uncertain. Presidential elections are uncertain. Climate change is uncertain. I'm not telling you what political view to have. I'm just telling you forces of energy that have an effect on the world that we're living in. And so somewhere as human beings, we are going to slide on this scale between the pursuit of contentment on the river of uncertainty. And we may be sometimes feeling awfully close to the uncertain side. And that's not problematic unless we pretend that we're not really there, when in actuality we are there. And on the other side, by the way, to be 99% uncertain or 99% content, that's great. Once you go to 100% of each other, on one end of the spectrum, then I think that's a little scary. I think 100% contentment with the belief that there's no uncertainty, that's delusional. And I think 100% uncertain
absolutely
without any pursuit of contentment, that's just sort of borderline darkness and depression. So I just want people to have at least a 1% view of the other side from where they are. But hopefully they're not at 99, but just take that moment to gauge where you are on that sliding scale. And then just say, okay, we're just starting from where we are. And that's it. And then we take the next step.
Mm-hmm. I can see that as being a really interesting dynamic spectrum from one end to the other. The uncertainty to the pursuit of contentment. I always think of contentment as satisfaction, your ability to find satisfaction. And that has to be an everyday, every moment thing, despite the uncertainty. So I really love this idea. I'm always thinking in terms of the spectrum of humanity. And that is just one more spectrum for me to consider. I think about the spectrum of gender and sexuality, and I think about the spectrum of religion and ethnicity. And when my boys were little, we would talk about heterosexual and homosexual and what that looks like, because I have cousins that are gay and with lots of people in our lives that are like that. So I wanted to make sure that they understood that that was normal as far as whatever normal looks like. And we would talk about the spectrum of all the way on one end being hetero and all the way on the other end being homosexual, and saying most of us fall somewhere in the middle. There's so few people on one end or the other of that spectrum. And I hope that it's the same for what you're talking about, although I have seen some people with completely buried heads that they think they have full control and they know that things are uncertain, but they think that they have full control, and then that's delusional. And I have seen people on the other end of that spectrum, doom and gloom, everything's uncertain. I have no life. I have no capacity or agency to build my own satisfaction and contentment. So I have seen that, but I truly believe that we mostly see that in public, in social media. I think when you get to an individual and talk to them, when they're not using platitudes and political remarks, you actually do find that most people are somewhere in the middle of that. What do you think?
Yeah, I sometimes, obviously when I'm talking with clients, my goal, my objective is to serve them where they are. Aspirationally speaking, I think something you said that kind of reminds me of this is that you mentioned your age. I'm a little bit older than you, not much, but we were very similar generation. I'm 51. I'd love to be coaching. We're doing what I'm doing for another 15, 20 years. I love it. So I also think a little bit about where I'd like to contribute, or maybe more aspirationally, like what I would like to see sort of coaching help to evolve. And one of the things for me is really, what do better cultures of trust look like, especially in the workplace? And when I say that, I mean, really what I'm saying is like, how can we help people bring their full selves to work? Mm-hmm. And with all of those, those spectrums that you were talking about. And I am sensitive, and I'll say this, that I think there are really smart ways. I credit people like Jerry Colonna from Reboot and Boulder. His book is a great book, but he talks a lot about this idea of how do we help people really bring their full selves to work, and trust is the only way. And by the way, to do this doesn't just it's not like you have to label every problem. First of all, what's happening in the workforce right now is that we have a lot of people that are doing their work from the time they check in to work to the time they check out. And then they go home to their lives where there's a lot of challenge and difficulty. Marriages are hard. Relationships are hard. A sick child, a sick parent, health, it's just so many forces that are derailing us. We don't sleep well. We don't eat well. We don't recover well. We don't rest well. And we come back to work the next day and we tell our bosses, I'm good. Let's get at it. And what's so hard to me about that, Sarah, is that if it's already happening, imagine if someone had the ability to just sort of come in to the workplace and say, you know what, Sarah, I'm a red light right now on the red, yellow, green light scale. I'm a red. And you don't have to label the problem. You don't have to get any more specific to that. But can you imagine how good it would feel to have the kind of trusting culture where you could just come in and say it? It would probably help you feel more relieved, more relaxed, and probably end up like feeling like work is a pretty good thing to do right now. And you know what else would happen if we really had these cultures of trust, is that then other people in the team would understand, hey, Joe is kind of red. Maybe there's something I can do to help him out, right? And it kind of, helps other people feel, more supportive of their team. And the final thing is, when Joe goes from red to yellow, or even yellow to green, when someone else goes to red, who's going to be the first person to step in and want to help them out? It's going to be Joe. And exactly. So it takes a while to get to things like this. It's not about turning the workplace into a dumping ground for everyone's problem. It's just trying to create a culture of trust where we really can bring our full selves to work, to give ourselves the chance that maybe if we can do better at work, maybe we can begin to achieve better things, not between the time we come to work and the time we leave, but between the time we leave work and come back the next day. that's when we're really going to open up and I think start to do better things in the workplace culturally. And that's just sort of an aspirational element to me about being in this industry is hopefully the kind of conversations we're having. It's like planting seeds with people that in 10 or 15 years might have significantly more oversight and more leadership
influence,
capacity. And that might open up more conversations and cultures of trust, in that time. And that would make me very happy.
Agreed. We are definitely on the same page there. I left my job in the public sector simply with that goal in mind, was to help people like their jobs again. And the way we're going about it is different, but the ultimate goal is the same. And you reminded me of a time that I had a conversation with my husband about bringing your whole self to work and how important that was. And it occurred to me as we were talking that when we can do this, it actually makes us more productive. And I think one of the first steps we have to take in order to make this work is to lower the hyperbole in an office. And what I mean by that is when I was interviewed for a job in higher ed, this is higher ed, not a hospital, not in the medical or health field, higher ed, they asked me about a time that I dealt with a critical situation. They used the word critical, a critical situation. And I said, well, I'm a project coordinator in higher ed. I'm not a physician. A heart attack is a critical situation as far as I'm concerned. I have dealt with stressful situations with major deadlines and had to deal with those. And so I'll tell you a story about how I handled that. But really, critical is a heart attack. And I'm not a physician. And I'm not the one on the table. So, it's all about really calling people out on the language they use. Is this really critical when you're talking about higher ed or even something in your office? It may be really important. It may be an important deadline. But I think removing hyperbole, or at least lowering its use, would be great.
One of the thing's about living in another country where English is not the first language, when I speak Catalan, you have to think. I'm still thinking out everything. It's not like just throwing up words.
It's not second nature anymore.
Yeah, it's not speaking the mother language anymore. It's just not. And then secondly, also when I speak English to people here who are interested in speaking English, that also is different. And so you choose your words very carefully. You're trying to communicate a thought. The sensitivity to words. I think I wrote this recently, but it's really funny is that, there are like some words in English that is like, just sound like strange saying them sometimes, like to say like, I'm content, right? It's like, well, if you're content, then you're not like chasing, you're not going forward, right? And like, it just almost sounds like weird. I remember when I first started thinking about this when I moved here 3.5 years ago, because when you say estic content, it means I'm happy, like I'm good in Catalan. And, but still it sounds on my English lips, it sounds a little strange to say like content. It's like, am I, and the
you don't have any ambition.
Like, well,
I mean, that's how people might take it. Right.
And I love that now. Like, I mean, I'm simple, slower, and less are like these 3 words that, I talk about a lot, on LinkedIn and a lot in my writing. It's not the way to live for everyone, but does define the way my neighbors here in Laseo in the Catalan Pyrenees live. Simple, slower, and less. And so, it is, as I've kind of embraced that, and knowing what enough is, and for me, and letting that is so much helped me kind of make decisions about what matters most in my life, but about words and about and how they even sound coming off of, out of your mouth and off your lips. It's, it is funny. Like I love to say like, or estás content, are you happy? And it's like, it's like a funny translation. Like we're okay saying, hey, are you happy? But content is sort of like, it's always felt like a big word, when I first moved here, because I was thinking of it as an English translation. And so anyway, I agree with you. And speaking English with Catalan people, and they all, feel like their English is not good enough. And I say, let me tell you something about English in the United States right now. It's changing a lot. American English is influenced by so many different things. We have a growing population of people who speak Spanish as a first language. Hip hop and rap music has had a huge effect on the way we speak English today. And so the influence of American English and British English on Spanish and Catalan people is really different. British English is really holding on to all the proper elements. And I think one of the things that I like about the English in the United States is that there's like, there's a lot of room to make it your own. And I always tell people here,
it's a living language.
It's so cool. I tell people, like, you could go to the United States right now, everyone would understand you, and they would say, no way. And I said, 100%. And, and I said, now you may not understand everyone there, but also the odds are getting a lot better that you're going to interact with someone who can speak Spanish, and often Spanish is a first language. And I said, how cool is that for you? It's like, you're not going to go to the United States and not get to where you want to go, and you're not going to starve. Your English is good enough to make sure you're going to get to where you want to go, and you're not going to go hungry. And so, and it's just going to get better after that. But, that the British style of English is a lot more strict, and it's about really getting it right. And, I suppose it's good to have both influences on a culture here that is interested in speaking more English. But it is one thing I really like about Netflix is like the greatest thing that ever happened to English over here. I'll say that it is absolutely, wonderful. And, our comedians, our music, from the US is, and Netflix is, I love the effect on English here. Now it's like, it's so fun, like listening to Catalan rap music, Catalan hip hop music. It's amazing.
I love that. It really is amazing what we learn by living in a different place, and that shift in perspective. That's why I'm such a huge believer in travel and experiential learning. And it's why I studied abroad in Australia when I was in school. My brother studied abroad in Nîmes, France. And
cool.
Our boys have traveled to Europe a couple times. And so I agree that it's kind of magical how that can shift your perspective about language when you can't speak your own language. And what I love about it is that it simplifies things, that you really simplify your language when you're speaking to somebody who doesn't speak fluently in the language that you're speaking. And anyway, I could go on and on, but I'd love to wrap this up with a story. If you wouldn't mind sharing a story about a recent coaching client, or any coaching client really, that you used an analogy with, that you remember a vivid recognition and shift in mindset. Do you have like one of those clients that you could talk about a specific conversation you had that you knew had a major mind shift for that person?
What I would say, I don't know if it's exactly so specific, but I think it is interesting. So I had the opportunity starting in the summertime to work on a one-to-one basis with a pretty large group of doctors at an amazing teaching hospital in Boston. And I Sarah, if you had told me at the start of 2020 that, I would be working with these world-class doctors, I would have said, number one, you're crazy. And then number two, the fact that that's happening in the middle of a global health pandemic was just amazing, was incredible. And of course, just like everything, that these conversations happen on, I don't know anything about helping people be a better doctor. I can't. I've never seen a medical textbook in my life.
Right.
So we make an agreement that the conversations that we're having is on the basis of a transfer of ideas, a transfer of experiences, things that I can carry over, from, for example, maybe my existence in high performance sport at some level with doctors being high performance at what they do. But the thing is that just like, a Team USA uniform is clothes, so is a white doctor, so is a white jacket, is sort of the uniform of a doctor. Right. And for all the good reasons we celebrate it. But I always say underneath the Team USA uniform, underneath the white jacket is a human being. And so as we get into these conversations, we really see that it's not about there's something they want to do better, about being a better doctor. It's usually something more like, I'd like to walk through the door at night and be more present for my kids,
more human. Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It always, things, and so what I would say, what kind of comes to mind, because this kind of came up with a few of the doctor clients that I worked with this summer, is that so often, typically you would jump into these shifts to be like, great, what time do you come home? And what are the things you can do when you walk in the door? And the way I kind of look at these things is I have something that I call, using from the river, upstream thinking. So if you're going to walk through the door at 7:00 at night and you want to feel different, it's not about start thinking about it as you're pulling the car into the driveway at 6:59 and 15 seconds. It's how can we really go to from when the time you wake up in the morning and start to build in elements to your day that involve rest, that involve recovery, that involve replenishing energy, that just being more mindful. It doesn't have to be big things. It can be 60 seconds of mindful breathing. It can be taking a small lunch break. It could be going outside to get a few breaths of fresh air. It could be about not changing the work you do, but when in the day that you're doing the work. It can be changing the, a little bit of buffers on the video calls that you're doing. It could be, if you're a doctor, when you do your entering notes into the electronic medical notes system, maybe batching those together at a certain part of the day, as opposed to trying to do it on the fly in between clients and sort of wearing yourself down. You start to add up all these little tiny things that you can do throughout the day that open up more mindfulness, that allow you to keep more energy and stop it from going to stupid places during the day. Stop getting derailed by certain things. So this mindset really of kind of how to sort of not just manage time, but manage energy better and replenish it better, then we can really start to move into what happens at 7:00 at night with a better chance of being successful at your goal when you walk through the door. So I have gotten much better in my own life and in my sort of coaching life. We get to what the problem is, but I very rarely go directly at the problem. I go much upstream of the problem to places in the day that before we lose our focus, before we lose our energy, before we lose our attention, what can we do more upstream to give ourselves the better chance that it's still with us come 7:00 at night? Because if you have the self-awareness at 7:00 at night, when you pass through the door, 100% you're going to get it right. Not even 99.9%, 100%. If you have the self-awareness when you walk in the door to catch yourself and say, oh yeah, that moment is here, you will do it. It's too easy.
Well, it's a priority, and you've set it through the whole day. And I think that's the key to any of the work that we do as coaches, is that it has to be the priority. It can't just be, I want to be better at this. It has to be, I am going to be better at this. And whatever it takes to make my family my priority, I'm willing to do. So I love that. And yeah, I could just imagine a doctor going through all of that and figuring out where the biggest energy drains are throughout the day and finding ways to address them. So
it was really fun. It was a
Yeah.
really fun, and we made progress on it. And I love all the clients that I work with. Right, my work at Valor Performance, I've shifted a lot back towards sales and technology clients for a bit, but our amazing chief executive officer and founder at Valor, Sarah Milby, she knows how passionate I am about doctors, and particularly I think something for me is also just, I think, some of the unique challenges to women in medicine. That's something I'm giving a lot of thought to as well through what I've learned working with clients as well. So that's something I'm thinking about longer term and bigger picture, and just sort of based on intake and learning. And I think that's just something of interest to me.
Well, that's awesome. And I'm guessing that in a year, if we revisit this conversation, you'll have some fantastic insights about women high performers in particular, and the differences in how we have to approach that. So I'll look forward to that.
Me too. I mean, I hope in 1 year, right now I'm just trying to have more of the conversations with women in different parts of medicine and try to understand the landscape a little bit better. But if I'm fortunate enough to stick around this scene for another 15 or 20 years, that, I think there is some seed planting we can do. I think there's some low hanging fruit. I think there is some kind of plumbing we can do to fix some of the pipes to get the water flowing a little bit better. Yeah, I think in all of those areas, but it's the system. We have an amazing medical school system in the United States, but that's very good at teaching doctors how to do some things, but it's not very good for teaching doctors how to do everything. And once we get a few years into that, we start to see that the profession has a lot of burnout and a lot of challenges. And we certainly want that to be a good thing. And, we really want for the people that are doing that kind of work, to feel good, to feel engaged, to have the energy, the disposition to be living the lives that they want to live. And, this is for all the talk we have about healthcare in the US. I think getting the doctors into a good place, a good disposition is a really big part of it. It's very challenging work on that standpoint. I admire their service, especially during this pandemic. My gosh, it was unbelievable.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Joe, this has been a fantastic conversation, as I knew it would be. And
I loved it.
Sincerely appreciate your time. This has been great, very full of insights and chock full of ideas and analogies to put visions in people's heads so that they have something specific to be thinking about as they make their minor adjustments, or not minor, subtle adjustments, totally different word. And something I've been very intense about is the language that we use.
Good.
So
good
subtle
one.
Adjustments with their paddle and with their body weight and with the weight of the boat, and just the adjustment of where their body is, and all those little details come together to make better decisions. So thank you so much. Appreciate
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm just so glad we've had this chance. And so we'll keep it going with some offline virtual coffees as well. Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Are you ready to start your story portfolio so you have the right story ready to share when the opportunity presents itself? When you're ready to get started, my book, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will, is available in all the regular places, and the audiobook version is available on Google Play and on my website, elkinsconsulting.com. As a special bonus for listeners, the audiobook includes 2 songs recorded by my band, Spare Change, in my living room in Montana. Also on my website is a free podcast interview checklist. It's available to download to make sure you make the most out of your next podcast interview. If you enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to rate the podcast and leave a review. And let me know that you've done it so I can thank you properly.
Thank you.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?